Here we are again. Good afternoon. Welcome to our friend and colleague, Jason. We're going to spend a little time talking about the new Shingle Style, the old Shingle Style, and exegesis of shingles. But I was just reading. Did you write this? You did.
Wait, what are you looking at? The Wikipedia thing?
No.
This? Yeah, this we did.
No, this is Wikipedia for hair shirts.
I didn't write that.
No. Thanks God.
I wrote this one.
Right.
Unless you didn't like it, then somebody else wrote it.
But reading the critical piece, which is Jason's description of what he did, what was curious or what was interesting to me, I'm trying to look for the right word and to keep it congenial, but it appeared to me that it might have been written by a critic, that there's a kind of schizophrenia in this discussion, meaning there's the object and the space and the material, which is in a sense an architect's discussion, subject, obligation. And then there's an analysis that has to do with bearskin and rawhide and very different topics that don't seem to be, at least from my point of view, particularly useful in understanding what's made and how it's made and why it's made. They seem to be, in a way, disconnected. Although I think maybe in your head, maybe you could talk a little bit about that, whether the issue of space or form or material or the power of the object is really illuminated, explained. We understand it better if we know about shingles and bearskins and rawhide.
Probably not.
So maybe the objective is to confuse us.
Probably not to any significant degree. I mean, my hope would be, well, first of all, I should say that I enjoy writing nearly as much as I enjoy design, and so you can't help yourself. You know, you just wind up writing about your stuff. But my hope, I would figure it would be any architect's hope, is that the object always surpasses whatever it is you've written about it, and that to write about an object is to, at the very best, give it a glancing blow, so to speak. I know that for me, you know, I don't know how others will assess it, but there were certain things that I had not anticipated about this object that would be so pleasing to me, that I had never written about, and in fact hadn't even thought that much about, that when the thing was finally constructed in this space, you know, I found these qualities coming off of it or inside of it that appear nowhere in that text or any other text. So I don't know, if your point is more or less the text doesn't live up to the object, I completely agree. And I hope so. I mean, if the text were better than the object, then I'm probably in the wrong
Here
line.
seems like a fashion subject. And more, it seems like when you look at the big topics in architecture, in terms of a spatial hypothesis or the relationship, this is an existing building, by the way. It's an existing building, which is a school, and will become a house. That to make hair the subject seems either superfluous or beside the point. And if the analogy is the curling shingle and a hairstyle, is the building a facsimile for the hair, or the hair a facsimile for the building?
It's more, yeah, I mean,
do we need that? I guess, do we need that discussion at all?
I think, for me, I need it. I don't know if you need it. For me, I need it. I've needed discussions that appear to some to be superfluous for a long time in my practice. Hair has been around for a while with me, this sort of rumination on hair and how to bring certainly an extra-disciplinary subject.
Hair's been
Hair's
around.
been a subject that's been on
And
my
you have
mind.
hair.
I do.
Congratulations.
No, but it's
distinguish you
how,
from everybody
how,
else.
how to bring the subject of hairstyling into architecture has been one of a small set of outside disciplines that I've been interested in bringing in. The point wouldn't be that I would ever tell anybody here that hair is the wave of the future in architecture. It's obviously not, other
the
than
hair's
possibly
wavy.
for me. It's really about seeing how the larger challenge for me has been how do you bring extra-disciplinary subjects into architecture? And several years ago, I started dabbling in ones that seemed less serious. I mean, to get at your point about hair doesn't seem all that serious. It seems like a subject of fashion. That became
Is the idea
challenge.
to diminish the gravity of the project so everybody knows you won't go out in the parking lot and cut your wrists or something over there?
No.
Because to transform it from a fashion subject or an architecture subject to a fashion subject, I just don't get the association. I don't see why it's essential or what it illuminates, how it helps us to understand. It may help us to understand something about you in a personal way, but I'm not sure it helps us to understand. I mean, if you left the room and didn't hand this out at all, my guess is that if we were looking for an explanation or a way to get into the discourse, we probably wouldn't start by talking about hair. So you're obligating that topic, I think, is what I'm saying.
Well, let me try it from a different angle. Years ago, I was, along with a number of other people here, heavily invested in the topological project in architecture. So that would be more fundamental than hair, let's say. This the kind of reinvigoration
You have
of
to tell me what a topological project is.
you know, the reinvigoration of it would be the promotion of surface as primary in architecture. And so
Topology is a conceptual form which is in a way shapeless, or it's not a shape predilection. It's an organizational strategy which could take, that's my understanding of the word, whereas this is a very particularized shape, which hopefully we'll get to.
And I'll get to. Anyway, the point is that a lot of the work that I was doing earlier on was, firmly in this lineage of what we call the topological. Somewhere along the way, I became increasingly dissatisfied with working with smooth, bald surfaces, hence the hair. It seemed to me...
There's some people ready to leave the room.
It seemed to me that the topological project had become too much about surface, where surface had become, in a very unhealthy way, separated from discussions of form or space, and not to mention material and material dynamics. And so I started searching for ways to reinvest an otherwise kind of clean, spare surface with more qualities that would have stuff to do with, material dynamics, material effects, and so on.
Don't the shingles, we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but if the shape of the building in its essence is recognizable and simple and a piece of history in a way, which it is literally, and the shingle separates itself from that and curls away from it, aren't you doing the opposite of what you just said? Because you're disconnecting the essential shape of the building from the finish of the building, which behaves not obligatory with respect to the shape, meaning it's not congruent, it doesn't conform to the shape, it differentiates itself from the shape, which is what you said you didn't want to do.
No, I don't, well, I hope I didn't say that. It differentiates itself from the shape and the form, but it enters into a renewed relationship with that space and form, or with the form and the underlying surface as a result of moving away from it or turning away from it. At least that's the thought.
Okay, we come back to that in a second. I wanted to mention one other thing because I did a little dictionary work a few minutes ago and looked up something, trying to find a way to tie the hair discourse into the discussion, or trying to find a way for me to make sense out of it. And there is something some of you Catholics may know called the hair suit. And a hair suit, and hair shirt, and which has something to do with self-mortification, which is a tough game, especially if you have a lot to atone for, which makes it even more personal. But it was the only thing, whether this is an architecture discussion or whether this is getting either more and more obscure in a critic's way rather than an architect's way, but could it be that self-mortification and a hair shirt, which is essentially something, as I understand it, you put on and either cuts your skin or that you suffer with as a way of atoning or repenting or acknowledging that there are things that you've done that probably should have been done otherwise. Does that pertain, or is...
No. I have nothing to atone for. I'm not Catholic.
Well, there's still time. Or maybe not. The intention isn't to offend anyone who happens to be affiliated with Rome. I mean the church, not the architecture. There is a mention in Jason's text of shingles and the shingle style, which for those of you who have followed this discussion over the years immediately brings up recollections of people like Vincent Scully and maybe Bob Venturi, with a certain kind of conservative building or traditional building. Which is, I don't want to call it a primitive association, but it's certainly a traditionalist's association. And then there's the bearskin and the rawhide references that have to do with a kind of enclosure. One suggests a little bit Wyatt Earp, Dodge City, Cherokee, Iroquois, Wild West. And the other suggests kind of housing in Nantucket. And again, not only with the hair, but the shingles and the rawhide. And the question is, what does that help us with? What associations are? Should we understand the building as a kind of Nantucket, Vincent Scully, shingle style derivative? Are we belittling it? Are we building on it? Are we making fun of it? Are we extending it?
Yeah,
or is it relevant?
It's absolutely relevant. That it's a perfect read. I mean, if in terms of the advertising image of this project or this exhibition, it would be the combination of the two references or associations that you just mentioned. So I don't know that, I wouldn't argue that I would be adding to the historical shingle style. What I would say is that I would hope to pervert it. And I think that when you pervert something that is strong, a strong form or a strong heritage or lineage, you need something equally robust to pervert that thing. And all I mean by pervert, I don't mean anything nasty. I just mean turning it. So it doesn't make, if this is a perversion or a playing with shingle style, it's not meant to elevate the shingle, reinvigorate that style into a new movement. It's really just meant to swerve it, to turn its direction. There's another reason, though, why the shingle style, the Scully version, is important with regard to the work, at least for me. I, of course, realize all of the associations with conservatism and all that. At this point, I'm fine with that. In the beginning, I wasn't. There's one thing if you really dig back into that material, and I don't know how many students have dug into that material. When I was a student, we weren't even required to read that stuff or look at that stuff too carefully. Digging back into it with this project reminded me of how much about form that stuff was. I mean, I think the most cursory reading of the shingle style now is that it's something to do with the style of cladding. In this case, wood shingles, or in certain cases, board and batten and other kinds of things. When you really read through that stuff, it's so much about form and mass and posture. If you think about the examples, for example, that Scully was using to illustrate the best cases of the shingle style, they were as much to do with mass and form and posture as they were about whatever the actual cladding was. And for me, with this project, it has been very much a kind of posture project.
So in a conceptual sense, to arrive at a full understanding of what the project is requires whoever is looking at it to understand something about the antecedents or the pedigree of the shingle style, meaning as an experience, it can't stand on its own. And the reason I ask you that is there seems to be, I don't know whether to call it a didactic piece, but one side has shingles in a conventional way, like, don't you get that? Or didn't you know that? Or haven't we found out that shingles go on like this? Yeah. And having established that, and it might be not only a chronology of what was done and what you've done, but how you see it, meaning the question would be if you came from one side and you said, oh, I think it's that, and then you came around to the other side and you said, no, it isn't. Because it really has to do with a kind of a learning sequence which is either built into the building in case somebody didn't know it, or a learning sequence which means you can't get it unless you know its history, meaning the Scully history or the tradition.
Yeah, I actually never, the reason that the flat side is flat was never meant to be didactic, but I completely understand that reading. I would have to say this, I think that I think I would disagree with you if you say you can't have a full understanding of this building without understanding Scully or without understanding its.
No, I'm not saying that's so. Precedent. I'm asking you if you think it's so, given the fact that you thought that was essential to the explanation. No,
I don't think
stands on its own.
I think it. Yeah, I think certain people would want. Yeah, I think certain.
Well, again, a critic's reading,
historians would probably
but we're not building for critics.
Right. No, I think my client doesn't necessarily know that history, nor does she care.
Right. So you may be having a couple of conversations, so you may be either talking to yourself in a critical intellectual way or aspiring to a kind of critical position which involves you in that discussion. But the building or the comprehension of the building, experience of the building doesn't obligate you to know that pedigree.
Correct.
And in fact, you've built it both ways.
Yeah,
you built it both ways. Is it peculiar to associate shingles and rawhide with digital?
Yeah, it is. I think so.
Peculiar in the sense that discontinuity is an asset, or peculiar in the sense that discontinuity confuses the meaning of the content in a way that you lose something? I mean, for instance, did you draw each shingle?
No.
Is each?
Well, in an earlier version of the digital model, we modeled each shingle.
Every single shingle?
Every single one.
So the argument for a digital capacity would be, guess what we can do? We can draw every single shingle, and we can replicate those shingles by curving them or bending them exactly the way we've drawn.
No, that wouldn't be the actual, it's a cynical argument, and I don't even...
Yours or mine?
No, mine. The reason that we originally made that digital model was because we were asked to by a venue who was going to host the work, that model back there, and they required us to produce a digital model. The theme of that particular show...
But that has really nothing to do with your intentions or what was necessary.
Right.
I'm talking about if you want to build...
You cannot replicate the... even though we digitally modeled every single shingle, well, actually you could replicate every single one. You wouldn't. Why you would do that is beyond me. So we haven't.
So you could get them exactly the way you wanted.
You could if you wanted. It would probably take 10 years.
Well, no, I mean, it has to do with a conceptual... I don't think it would take 10 years. I mean, there's certainly now, with the capacity to take an object and vary it infinitely and engineer it and fabricate it, you could do that.
You
and
could.
then, if you did it, you could argue that, and the question is really to do with the sensibility. I mean, for instance, if I took that shingle right there and twisted it, so now I'm going to make it different than the way,
Right.
do you care?
Depends on how good the twist is, I suppose.
So it's okay.
Yeah,
it's
if it's
okay
compositionally
okay.
better than this, then yeah, you should do it.
Well, because what I'm asking is the relationship between a traditional building form and the surfacing of that building in a predictable way, in a standard way, walls, roof, and so on.
right.
And now what you call perverting it, and you've done that, if you've done that, but in your explanation, you've done that by bending the shingles or allowing the shingles to bend. So the conceptual idea, which by the way has something to do with things like water, whether we ever get to that. In other words, it has to do with keeping the inside in and the outside from inside,
Right.
you know? So maybe we'll get to the question of whether it leaks or not, or maybe it should leak or not.
No,
But I think the point would, and maybe this is the objective, especially if it's a building which is not inhabited, but is a kind of study object, like an installation, which you just said was at least part of the discussion. Anyway, I just wanted to understand whether the specificity, I mean, if you look at this thing, if you stand in the doorway and look at it, you get a sense of the kind of variability of the shingles, and you recognize that what you're seeing is not a typical application of the shingles. And all I'm saying is, does each one matter? And because there is an argument, if in a certain conception of architecture, certainly by architects we know that if you move anything, I'm picking it up and taking it away. So that's the way it is, that's the way I designed it, and that's the way it has to be, as opposed to the variability is a function of a number of circumstances, and it wouldn't bother you if we moved it around a little bit.
No, right. And in fact, the intention of the project is that it's forever in motion. Once it's built in the harsh climate of the actual site, the whole point of these things was to become, forgive the term, but stochastically animated, which is to say animated by the weather. The freeze-thaw dynamics on this particular site, which have been playing out on the existing building, which is built of this kind of material for 100 years.
So if you look at the existing
It's
building, it
already
already looks like that.
Well, not.
So
I
they
hope not
think
as
you're
good.
building an
but,
antique.
But yeah, no, it's doing the same thing behavior. The material is behaving the same way. What I'm trying to do is control it compositionally. But it gets back to your question of does each individual shingles profile matter? The answer is no. Not on each
But it
individual.
matters that it deviates from the conventional,
That matters.
which
Yeah.
would conform to the frame of the building.
Right, right. The one thing that does matter about every individual shingle, it's just a technical point, they do need to attach to the surface properly such that the building does remain waterproof.
Yeah, but
It's a
as
boring
they
technical
lift up, I mean, there would be a way to do this, which would be essentially to waterproof the
Right.
building without using the shingles.
Exactly.
There's-
Or you do a flat layer, you do that layer of shingles
Which then
under
makes
this
it
layer.
even more of a haircut, because it's
yeah.
superfluous in a way. So it really, it's a way to decorate the roof and make a kind of comment out of the use of the shingle or the misuse of the shingle, but it's no longer a shingle in terms of its operational intelligibility, meaning you put on
Yeah,
shingles
it's
in
no
order
longer
to do
a waterproof membrane.
in a utilitarian sense.
Right.
It's not that.
Right.
So the way you've done it, the water will come in.
In this exhibition, yeah, if the things came on, the water would go through. But the way it's drawn, the water will not go through. It's
And that's
drawn as a
because you
water-
have something else.
That's something else.
But that's
right.
also at least of some interest, meaning that the meaning of the shingle in an operational sense, in a utilitarian sense, is gone.
Right.
So
correct.
it whatever term you want to use, it decorates the building. It
Yeah, whatever-
embellishes the building.
Right.
It is an effect.
Yes.
It's an effect. It requires a technical manipulation in terms of how to make it, but it doesn't operationally do
Correct.
what shingles typically do.
It's
So
useless.
it's not a shingle anymore.
Right. It's useless in reference to the original definition of what a shingle needs to do,
Right.
at least in
Because
terms of performance.
the question is, would it be more interesting or more substantive if it were both, meaning it was operationally intelligible, it was utilitarian. Nonetheless, its shape was not quite recognizable. But it was recognizable in the sense that shingles are supposed to be like this, and now they're like that.
Right.
So it operates
Yeah, I don't
better
know
or
if
worse,
that's.
doesn't matter.
I don't know if it's more interesting. And I believe you can achieve that, actually. It's trickier technically. It just really depends on how you deal with the back end of the shingle that's hidden. I don't know if that's more interesting or not, honestly.
Well, maybe, I mean, it's an issue because it's a substantial decision, I think. Let me ask you something else about the relationship of the, I was looking at the model. I don't know if we can get to the floor here, but certainly from the outside, the outside, inside the building, you don't get this. So not only is it
inside the building, you don't.
when you're inside the building, you don't understand it at all. So it doesn't, in terms of how one could obligate a surface, a building surface, relative to a building form, relative to its effect or its consequences externally, relative to its consequences internally. And of all of those possibilities, it doesn't operate in a utilitarian way, and it doesn't make the space internally. In other words, if people are inside the school more, or inside the house more than they're outside the house, so it's a kind of effect, it's a kind of sign, it's a point of view, it's an object. In terms of a place where you would spend time or reside or understand, because looking at a roof, the variable roof, could have a meaning in terms of not only the room you're in, but the relationship of the frame, the wood frame, to the finish. So it could be part of an interior world, and it isn't.
Well, I would beg to differ a little bit. It isn't in terms of when you're inside the house, you have a furry surface. You don't. Where it does play a large role in the interior space of the project is in this location right here, this inflection. Well, there's two reasons for it. The one that pertains to the question you're asking has to do with, we bent, we call this the neck of the building. We
Curve.
bent it, we made this curve specifically on site and in reference to the rest of the building mass in the, on the side that catches the most weather. So as I said, this building that exists, the part of the building that exists, which it's the normal part on the model over there, one side faces bad weather, the other side doesn't, and it's really obvious which side is weathered and which side isn't. This side.
But does the weather really work that way? Like it rains on one side and the sun shines on the other?
No, but it doesn't. I mean, I can show you evidence of this. It's the one side that's facing the
Is it
storm
sun? Is
path.
it wind?
No, it's free. It's basically the path of the storm. 90% of the storms that come into this valley come through one kind of slot canyon.
But is it
right
literally
behind
this literal? In other words,
No, it's
would
not
it be,
this bad.
Well,
I mean,
I don't
not
mean
this rough.
good bad, but I mean that it's very clear.
It's very, very
that
clear.
one side will be forever the convention, and the
Yes.
other side will be the exception. Because when it curves, it has to move. In other words, the orientation of the building changes, and you would think that the curve condition itself would provoke something which either curves as a surface. I mean, when the thing curves in plan, that it would also do something to the shingle, meaning that it runs straight.
Right.
It does one thing. When it curves into the weather, or it curves out of the weather. Well, you're not doing
Well, this
it.
side curves into the weather. Basically, the point of this particular feature here is that it gets even tighter, even, let's say, messier in terms of the shingles. It'll retain more moisture. The freeze-thaw dynamics will be worse in this area, provoking more kind of shingle curling to go on. Anyway, the point of all of that, to get back to the question of the interior, is that interior bend, if you look in the model or in the plans, the interior bend is inexplicable. If you were inside the house,
It's bending and it's
there
going
would be
downhill.
no point to
Right?
that curve.
It's bending and it's going downhill.
Yeah, well, not on the ground floor, but the second floor is going downhill. To be inside this house, there is no explanation for that particular, bend in the plan, in the interior.
You mean in terms of how the interior is used, or in terms of whether you're bending it around a boulder? I mean, in terms of external
No,
conditions?
just the way the space is experienced. I mean, it throws an otherwise absolutely bilaterally symmetrical long space into one that's no longer bilaterally symmetrical, one that's bent, basically.
But you're saying there's no explanation for that?
No, the explanation is on the outside of the building. So
How is the
all of this
explanation?
stuff,
This is consistent right across the curve. In other words,
not
as this bend is, or am I wrong?
the idea is that it gets more bent in this particular like catcher's mitt area. And in the model, we were able to sort of simulate that more dramatically.
So where would that be?
Right there.
At the point where it curves.
Right.
So the issue of the curve was to curve it into the weather,
To make things
which
worse
would make
right
the
here.
consequence externally with the shingles more pronounced.
Yes.
Right.
And then
But when
on
you
the
curve-
interior, it has an impact on the floor plan, obviously. There's this
Obviously.
curve that
Right.
otherwise is...
So it's the decision was a function of the effect or exacerbating the effect of the weather on the shingles.
Right.
But it had a consequence internally.
Right.
But you can't see internally the fact that what's external to you or over your head is affected as you go around the corner. Because although it's hard to see, I mean, if what you're saying is the point where you move, where you turn, where you start to change orientation, is affected in a significant way because of the weather, because of the roof, then internally it might be of some interest to understand what has happened externally not only results in a curve in the plan, but it results in a circumstance in the roof, in the shape of the roof. Because the shape changes when you go around the corner,
Right.
but you don't know that.
Well, no, you can see the shape change. Though
No,
I'll
I don't
say
mean
that-
I don't mean the shape of the frame and the position of the floor. I mean the consequence to the surface of the building.
I see.
You don't get that.
No, you don't.
Let me ask you something else that occurred to me, and maybe this relates to the digital discussion. How big is a shingle?
For what, one of these?
How big should it be? Is it the right size or wrong size? I mean, should
Standard
it be
ones
a
are the
foot-
wrong
No, I don't
size for
mean
this
that.
project,
I
so-
don't mean what you can buy, which is another question, whether you can buy it in a lumber yard or whether you can fabricate it, because you're going to the trouble, at least in this case, to fabricate all of the pieces. So the question would be in perverting, in your term, I'm not sure that's the right term, but certainly in altering the conventional perception of the consequence of using a shingle, is the size of the shingle part of that discussion? Let's say the shingles were 1/2 meter square, let's say. So that the size of the materials, and not only disassociate the shingle from the roof in a conventional way, or shingle to shingle, or shingle over shingle, but you also change the size of the shingle itself.
Right.
Is that a consideration?
Yes, it is. And it was. What we wanted was to get our shingle as close to the standard as possible. Ideally, I would have wanted to have an absolutely standard shingle, which is just a bit shorter than these. These are 4 inches wide, which is standard, by 24 inches long, which is longer than the standard shingle. Not much, but longer.
Longer because it has to curl up.
Right. We needed that extra
But
length
in-
to do
in-
the curl.
in-
But for us, like, to make a radically different shaped shingle would have been really problematic. Like, for me, I wanted
You mean
the
you wouldn't know
reference.
it was a shingle anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I actually did want to play with the reference back to standard shingles and all of that stuff. That's interesting.
Because it's a question of at what point that association with a traditional shingle breaks down. Does it break down as a consequence of size? Does it break down as a consequence of shape? Because on the other side, if you were making these pieces, if you were engineering, fabricating, and building these pieces, and making each piece in a very particular way, then it might follow from the digital fabrication process as opposed to the traditional shingle making process that there's another step you could take. The question is whether it disassociates yourself from the association because you want to make an association which is essentially forward and backward in time. Forward and backward in time, and the question is, do you have to keep the shingle as a shingle?
Yeah, we think so. I mean, for this particular project, we think so. In general, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that. I think in general, probably I would. I think in general, on a let's say a project that was not a renovation project like this, where the context of the existing building wasn't so strong, I imagine my tendency would have been to explore very different shapes. If I were shingling a building, I would probably be exploring different shapes, and certainly wouldn't feel beholden at all to traditional shingle shapes. That particular decision comes very much from this project and what the existing conditions are and so forth.
There's in the model, if you have a chance to look at the model, there are a couple unusual pieces aside from the roof. One is the floor, the other is the site. And the way the site is modeled suggests a kind of regular, it looks like irrigation ditches or something. A couple of questions. One, should there be in the facsimile, in the mock-up, a for instance about the site, which isn't concrete, or a for instance about the floor? And the association, I mean, we talked about whether there was an association in the inside between the form of the roof, the form of the frame, the shape of the plan, the shape of the section, and now the condition of the floor. And it's a little bit tough to talk about because you can't see it, but the making of the floor and the making of the site, so essentially the ground plane are also related, at least one to the other. Whether they're related to the section of the building is a different question. Okay. So maybe, in other words, did we miss something that's essential to the conception of the building? And if it's essential to the conception of the building, what's the meaning of the floor, and what's the meaning of the irrigation ditches or whatever they are in the land form in the model?
I would say that the irrigation plan is far more essential to the understanding of the building on its eventual site than is the interior floor. Now, that's a different question as to whether I should or shouldn't have put them in here. I mean, I was up to a whole other operation in here just about dissociating this thing not only from the gallery but from itself. From, you know, this is right now, even though this is all going to get trucked to Utah and used, right now it's interesting to me to try and see it as an object dissociated even from the project, even from the project in Utah. But to return to what you were asking about, in terms of the lines of cultivate, it is. That geometry does correspond to cultivation or to irrigation. It basically
is that earth? Is that what that's supposed to be? So it's plowed earth? It's plowed
earth that's bermed up. It's basically a kind of or elongated, swollen ha-ha wall, if you will, or it's meant to operate like a ha-ha wall. If a ha-ha wall, because there actually are cattle running around that need to be kept away from the house.
I have no idea what a ha-ha wall is.
You know exactly what a ha-ha wall is. We all know what a ha-ha wall is. The fences, there are
I don't know what
the typical way to keep cattle, not to mention trespassers, off of your property in this part of the country is with fences. I didn't want a fence. The client doesn't want a fence to disrupt the view. Well, we all know that in history, one of the greatest ways to at least keep cattle and sheep and so forth off your property is with the ha-ha wall. So you send your front yard, so to speak, out however far you want, drop a small wall, tall enough to keep the cows from stepping up over it, and there you've got your wall. This berm thing was meant to provide a kind of visual. There's a road that's about a quarter mile off the site. The client doesn't want to look at that road, but she wants to see what's beyond, so it's a kind of...
But what's in the model is literally what you understand it to be, something planted on that?
Yeah, and then she wants to grow raspberries up there. That's a good climate for raspberries. So there's 4 of these rows, and in each 4 there's the 4 species of raspberries that she knows how to grow.
Let me ask you one other thing. It has to do with the subject of age. There are inevitably, if you make a building, and I think you alluded to this, that the shingles will behave in a certain way. If you make a building out of core 10 steel, Ford foundation, rain, snows, oxidizes, and so on. And I think we understand the process. I don't know that we understand always technically, but we understand what happens to metal, we understand what happens to concrete, we understand what happens to plaster, we understand what happens to glass, we even understand what happens to shingles. So there's a chronology of building and building materials that has to do with time. And I think there is some interest in that conceptually, and I think a worthwhile discussion in terms of how durable buildings are and how they age. I mean, I was just saying this to John, you can come and spray your hair gray, or you can just hang out, and sooner or later it'll become gray. And so the question is whether essentially aging the building, in other words, when the building is new, the building is old. And it's old in the sense that what we're looking at is, in a causal sense, a function of time and weather and place. But there's some weather, but not necessarily sufficient time. In other words, this isn't an effect, this isn't the building in 30 years. This is the building 30 minutes after it's been constructed. So then, how does a building which is old when it's new get old?
Well, first, let me say, the old thing, I mean, just so that nobody makes the mistake, there's not meant to be a nostalgic component here. It's not meant to be a project where the weathering looks like weathering, where the age looks like age. It's not a ruin project, or it's not kind of romanticizing that stuff. The weathering and the aging of the material, really my interest is, and I happen to really love this particular surface effect, and I want to see more of it. So that, like, the older the building gets, and my pre-aging of the building is in service of this particular surface effect. It's not in service of a kind of romanticized notion of the past was better than it is now, and old buildings are better than new buildings, or they look, so let's just make sure that that's clear.
It's not so much that, it's that if you wander around from Stonehenge to SCI-Arc, and you see what the consequences are, you see that in human affairs, you see it in built affairs, of time in architecture. Right. And this is a useful subject and an interesting subject.
Yeah,
even when somebody builds a building, there's always a question, there is inevitably the question of how do you maintain it, how do you sustain it, how do you keep it the way it is, or do you let it go?
Right.
The core 10, you let go.
Right. Well, no, so having made the distinction between pre-aging for the purposes of effects that I hope are actually quite contemporary versus pre-aging for nostalgic reasons, there was a change from the time we started this project to when we really started planning the construction of this thing in this gallery. There was a fundamental change. Originally, I had intended to only slightly pre-bend the shingles on this side of the building, such that they would get a little bit of ice and water and start the thing. But basically, the original conception was, let's start from the beginning and move forward. At some point along the way, I realized that that doesn't mean anything. Starting at the beginning or at year zero or day zero doesn't mean anything, actually, in the scope of this project. And so this amount of curling, I don't know, based on what's going on in the existing building, this is probably 50 years worth of material dynamics at play, freeze-thaw dynamics at play. And it doesn't matter to me that I'm starting at year 50 and moving forward. And so that question has been really interesting for me. For a long time, people in the office were thinking, you can't do, and I was too, you can't build it pre-curled. It's there was this kind of sense that it wasn't true to the original idea, or something, that we were somehow selling out, I guess is the, and I kind of thought that too. At some point I realized it's a bizarre notion. and that to
But
start
then
it
it has
at year
to
50
do,
is a good idea.
when you talk, this is your term, whether it's a perversion or not, but essentially when the building is done, the curving is done, it's complete, as opposed to dealing with building in time as buildings traditionally have done. So if it's, I think perversion is not the right word, but it's a very different conception of time. There was a movie, I think somebody was telling me about this a few minutes ago, where the kid was born old, and then as the kid aged, the kid got young or something, which is a contemporary movie. It's the subject of time in building and the subject of time in human affairs. You're jumping the gun on that in a way. And I think that's one of the interesting conceptual questions. And I think in a way it makes it more of an installation discussion than it does a building discussion, because I think it really is a single topic, and it's a commentary on building life in time. It wouldn't have to do with anything else. It wouldn't have to do with hair, or whether you like hair, or whether you have an argument with traditional shingle style and you want to rearrange it. It's about speeding up time in a way and understanding the building. I think that's conceptually, philosophically, a very unusual argument to make with a building.
Why, now I have a question for you. Why is that more of a, you might be right, this isn't an argument really, but why is that more of an installation question than a, let's say, in situ or finished project
I think
question?
that's a broader issue. I think what I'm saying is that as a building subject, if you include some of the things we've talked about, the relationship of the inside to the outside, or the relationship to the form of shingle on the curve and the form of shingle off the curve, for instance, which you can't read here. It looks like it's pretty much consistent. And you can't participate in the salient architectural gesture in the building as soon as you leave the outside. So it belongs more to the neighbors, and there aren't too many, than it does to the interior. And I think there are other obligations that could have been attended to that associate the original gesture with a more complicated idea about the relationship to the land, to the floor, the shingles to the outside, to the inside. You're right. I mean, you can't look that up in the appendix of the international style and say, okay, you should associate. But there are opportunities to associate an experience externally and a consequence internally, which particularly in terms of one side which is consistent and predictable, and the other side which is variable, and the variable side which separates itself from the frame. It wouldn't have to do that, as we said. You could remake the shape, and the shingle could be round, and the round shingle could be glued to the shape. Meaning you change the shape of the frame, you change the shape of the volume, the shingle is still a shingle, but now the shingle goes over a curving surface rather than an orthogonal surface, which means it doesn't separate from the orthogonal frame, it conforms to the bent frame, would be another way to do it. I'm just looking at it as possibilities, and I think there are possibilities that are still available to you to discover and to explore. And maybe by the time you get around to building the building in the next year or so, that some of those things will come out as a consequence of this. Anyway, anybody else want to add or subtract from this discussion? Please feel.
I've been hearing you talk a little bit about posture, and today, for the first time, I thought about perversion in posture, a perverse posture, and that maybe the school had a posture when you got there, the school as it was, and then you...
School meaning existing building.
Existing building. And then this being a perversion, not necessarily only of the shingle style, but of its existing posture. And I'm wondering then, in a way, as a point of comparison, like what Duchamp did to the Mona Lisa, as a kind of perversion of her posture by adding an element of hair, actually, but also, giving it a kind of perverse caption of sorts, like where she has some sinister thought. So the question I have for you is that you stood back away from the original, what all of us think perversion means, by trying to say, it's just a swerve, it's just a turn. But at the same time, in this case, it was a schoolhouse, and now it's something else, and it had a posture, a public posture. Now it's a private posture. I'm wondering if you can talk about those things in ways that, and also maybe as a response, if you see them also as a response, in as much as you saw hair as a response to a bald surface, do you see character and posture as a response to another set of disciplinary kind of erasures?
Well, let's see if I can get to the second part, but the first part cuts right to the core of how the project began, and where my head is still in other projects that are nothing to do with Mormon schoolhouses. The posture of the building, as I said earlier, it's radically bilaterally symmetrical, the existing condition. It also has a pitched roof, as you can see. And I think any of us struggle, any of us from this school and our school and most other schools these days probably struggle with the notion of what do you do with the project that you just got where you've got to deal with a pitched roof. Anyway, where you can't remove the pitched roof. It just, for a lot of reasons, that there was no option to make a flat roof. Some of those reasons are from the community around it. Some of those reasons because I frankly don't want to remove the pitched roof. But anyway, the posture thing comes into play with regard to largely that pitched roof. The pitched roof, as I understand it, you're probably better at this than I am, but has deep anthropomorphic ties. And so one of the largest reason for it ducking down, the head sort of ducking down and taking on the posture that it takes on, is to evade the anthropomorphic. Basically, I was struggling to find a compositional or a posture, a massing, that resisted clean anthropomorphism. Hopefully I'm not giving too much away when I say that I was studying the bovine form very, very carefully in order to get at a posture that's not human. And whether I've achieved bovine form in architecture or not, I have no idea. But that was a way for me to see. I don't know how to say, or I don't know as a designer how to make a massing or an object that's not anthropomorphic without something else to look at.
Well, it's a peculiar.
So anyway, that's where that came from.
It's a peculiar question, because if you want to insist that, whether this has an anthropomorphic pedigree and what that means and who says so. So this is. But if you assume there's a traditional argument for the building form, and it has to do with what's easier to build, to frame, and keep the snow off the roof, never mind bang your head on the inside, then at what point do you depart from the meaning of the shingle and sustain all the other meanings in the building and say, well, gee, I can't do anything with a roof? And in fact, we have changed the roof. We've inclined it, we've twisted the building in plan. So the argument about a traditional construction argument, it is a certain shape. Why is it that shape? Operationally, that has a meaning, but at a certain point, you jettison the meaning and you come and you do something else. And all I'm saying is, once you start playing with the meanings of the building in that way, you could do any of the things you talked about. It wouldn't be a better project, but there isn't any way. There's nowhere that it says you couldn't flatten the roof or push down on the roof or step on the roof and do any of those things. It would have been intriguing and obligated the building at a level that it's not obligated at the moment, because there are no internal obligations at all. It's not as if it's, at least in this discussion, how it would be inhabited, why it would be inhabited, what actually opens up the side, what do you see, who sees in, outside, inside, all of that. If it remained a school, and a Mormon school, and what you had to deal with either in terms of a pedagogical intent or ritual intent or the relationship between religion and this kind of building, which has something of a tradition, and bending the religion and bending the pedagogy and bending the school, then you get into some, I think, discovery conditions. In other words, how the hell do you continue to run the school, for example, in a building where you used to be able to see from one end to the other, and now you have to see around corners, which makes for a different way of understanding the space. I think maybe that would be, that's not the use, but on the other hand, the lady who inhabits it and inhabits it in a certain way could also be operationally part of the discussion and the way the building moves. Anyway, anybody else?
As you know, we share an interest on perversions and chaos, but that's not the point. The point I want to ask you, there are two things. One thing that we discussed in your seminar, when going back between the digital is that one of the current trends was there was a certain incapability on the part of the students to draw or model anything they couldn't think first in the computer. So that was the one thing, and in relation to that, I want to ask you, if this condition of mixing these territories have to do with the desire on the search of kind of imperfect logic that try to challenge a certain perfect mathematical equation that start to embed it with the computational work, what I find it interesting and complicated to deal is, as it has been recently put, the notion of the computational digitalization of certain logics as becoming like a latent style, and the notion to bring the word style with the notion of imperfection of that in style. Is that a reactionary attitude, or is just a necessary factor of contamination to move the discussion somewhere else? If the desire to introduce an imperfection in relation to the work of a style in a dialogue with a contemporary notion of a style, as I did, it was an ambition to produce a reactionary attitude towards that, or just to move the discussion into kind of a more micro or close-up?
It was meant to move the discussion into more macro territory. My feeling is that the hyper-stylization of that we've come to know as parametricism, is this what you're talking about here, Non? That's the micro. You know, back 3 years ago, or whenever this thing was put in that show with a cast of characters who would attract an audience that was expecting a certain thing. Part of the reason for me putting this project in that show versus some other project in that show was to try to broaden the game or open up the field as opposed to close it down.
Yeah, but that's why I asked you the question.
By the way, it's nothing. That's not a commentary on our friends. It's more a commentary on.
Yeah, but look, that's why I asked Jason the question of whether each shingle is by intention exactly what it is, or whether it has to do with the accident of inclement weather. And in order to build this and build this way, both are actually possible. So in fact, it's not that it leaves room for accident. I mean, we could determine whether it does or it doesn't. It could be understood as the quintessential parametric project because it diminishes or it belittles or it trivializes. It takes the smallest piece and it makes each one of those small pieces in a very particular way, in a position, with a shape, on the surface, and then you put it up. So that's not contradictory to parametricism necessarily. It may be the ultimate conclusion. Except it's wood.
Yeah.
is a way to reshape the way that the work is understood. In other words, if the work takes a life of their own, they start to create almost like a new conceptual frame.
Yeah. Okay, I can respond to that. At the time, the bovine, like I was just talking about the bovine's always been at the heart of the project, and it always will. Rawhide and bovine are two different terms, and the use value of this term rawhide for me in the past year and a half with regard to this has been, well, now I just lost my train of thought. How did I just lose the train? I had a fantastic answer for that. Here it is. It's back again.
Better be good, baby.
And especially for this show, as we started to try to figure out what do we want to do for this show, I wanted to explore just the fur coat aspect of the building, so to speak, not the rest of it. It's a comprehensive building proposal elsewhere, but for this show, I wanted to see just how much isolate the kind of the coat, the coat, cladding as coat.
See, I don't see why you guys, I don't know where the frame of reference comes from for where's perversion? What's, they're arguably, yeah, oh, well, yeah. Well, you have different problems. But in architectural terms, there might be a question of whether, given the possibilities for form and shape and finish, that anything would be considered much of a perversion or a departure at this point. Perversion's the American Congress as a perversion of, I mean, this is perversion or sickness or something. I mean, huh? But I think in...
Now, you bring up postmodernism, and I have to step in.
We're trying to give you a good way.
No, because I think perversion is getting in the way of a lot of the...
Can somebody out
Part of the
there,
conversation?
Todd, hold on a second. Can somebody out there just tell the people who are chowing down on Rawhide to wait about 5 minutes? Just ask them to be quiet because nobody can hear what Todd's saying. Thank you very much.
But now I have to be really good. But no, I think that where it starts to deviate, and this is the point that I really wanted to make, was that it moves away from a kind of signifying understanding, like the shingles as they were sort of reappropriated and perverted in the kind of postmodern Gray's debate in the 70s, what had to do with a kind of symbolic use of the shingles, right? That their meanings were kind of foregrounded. And I think what's important here, and I think Jason has gone to great pains to foreground, despite the symbolism of a giant cow laying in a field, despite the kind of various symbolic or at least metaphorical associations the thing has, is that you're going to great pains to maintain the kind of material logic of the shingle as the sort of operator above everything else. So, and I think that the metaphors are getting in the way of the material research that's going on. Or like, how much can I get the shingle to do? How much, so like, because it's got to still be a shingle, but it's got to get at these color effects. It's got to get at these curve effects. It's got to have associations with a number of different sets of interest in recent architecture. And the funny thing is that the metaphors kind of overshadow all the other ones.
That may weaken it a little bit. And I think I was trying to figure out a way to say this when we first started. The question is it a critic's building or is it an architect's building? And to the extent that it seems to belong or is subservient to a kind of intellectualization of a discourse, which is, I don't know whether it's an arcane discourse or an obscure discourse, certainly a discourse that doesn't involve the same components as a spatial discussion, I think that may weaken its argument or its force or its power or its space or its presence, which in a way have very little to do with how you might describe it as a critic. And I think to some extent the architect is a critic and the critic is the architect, and maybe those things run into each other and you have to pick one or the other.
But am I following you? Are you assigning the kind of material logic or the sort of ineffable qualities of the project to the architect side of it
I'm
and the intellectual
assigning the
associations to the critic side?
decision-making process to an intellectualization of an argument as opposed to other kinds of motivations that would drive the making of a form or a space or a material. And that if it ratifies itself as an intellectual argument, which might be of some interest to the architect, that wouldn't necessarily confirm its validity as a piece of architecture, although it might make it a useful piece of discourse. I think they're different. And when you do both of those things, it's hard to make it all come out. And I think my instinct would be to defer to the architecture issues and not necessarily to see how the argument serves the architecture. Because I think when the architecture serves the argument, that may make the argument a priority and not the architecture.
I think I agree.
I think you probably don't.
No, I'm pretty sure I do, because I mean, for me, it's the, like, what you can get the wood to do seems to be the primary interest.
Yes, I agree with everything you said. Despite that, here's what I'd say, and don't take this the wrong way, because what you said is absolutely right, and I do privilege that particular aspect of the project above most others. And if metaphors or whatever, associations would be a word I would be more comfortable with, but if that world starts to impinge upon our appreciation of material mechanics, that could be a problem. But here's what I would say. Despite the fact that I agree with what you said, and it's a correct reading of where my priorities are, I've become so bored with the kind of increasingly technocratic discussions surrounding material dynamics and performance that I can't take it anymore. So even though I'm still very strongly, I hope that my work will continue to be part of that effort that's undertaken by a whole lot of people, if the discussion is going to continue to zero in on this sort of increasingly narrow, as I say, technocratic thing, such that other stuff can't play a part in it, then the work will still probably be like that, but I won't want to take part in those discussions. Here's an easier way to say it. If an association starts to rub up uncomfortably against a higher material priority, right now and where I'm at with the work, I kind of like that. I would like to see how that uncomfortable friction plays out, and it could play out badly. But for right now, I'm happy with that.
I think what Jason just said is useful. I don't think that the alternative to a mechanistic or a machine-oriented or a techno argument is to juxtapose it with a critical discussion about the relationship between shape and a shingle style. So there are other avenues in the discourse which wouldn't necessarily obligate you to associate a use or an abuse of a shingle with a need to get away from a kind of mechanized way, a machine-like way of arguing. And I think the distaste for that argument, which is now a very old argument, it's a kind of utility argument, although the tools are more sophisticated now. But the argument is still similar, that you make it, and what you make is radical architecture if its symptoms or its qualities represent a sophisticated use of drawing and fabrication tools, and those are expressed in the building. And if the instinct is to abuse that, and not to say the expression of a sophisticated technique is itself sophisticated architecture, that it's already a tedious argument, and you heard it, and generations have done it. Let's make a different argument. That doesn't mean this is the argument, but it means that that argument is flawed, and it ought to be, we ought to come after it. Did you want to say something? Otherwise, we.
Yeah. Jason, I wish I didn't know you so well, because now there's so much to talk about, and Eric as well. But it seems to me there's another building built with shingles that's about 32 years old now that's behaving badly as well, the Pedal House. So maybe this is 50 years on, Pedal House is 30 years off, it's tilting out, the shingles are falling out. So it's kind of playing that game with the shingle as well. It seems to me that the shingle is a kind of a prompt to talk about the stochastic or the feral, right? And so I read it much more like a prompt in the way that a writer would cite or bring up the idea of chaos, the feral state, within nature, within architecture, within the parametric project. And that seems really interesting, because you bring the contemporary project to the school, as many people do, although it doesn't arrive in the obvious form, which is what you said earlier. So I think for students, it's super important that you need to decode this, to pull it apart, to understand what the discourse is. And it's for us. It's not for others, it's for us. And that's how it changes, alters, and pushes architecture forward to a small group of people that then obviously understand it, pull it apart, talk about it, say it's like what I'm doing or it's not like what I'm doing, etc. So for me, the fascination, in terms of the idea of the skin of an animal, the bovine reference, is to understand the idea of skin in architecture as something that can have micro adjustments and micro behaviors and difference within it, and not be a global condition that wraps a building. So therefore, the argument about the valley, the intensity of the freeze-thaw cycle, really is an idea about the potential of architecture to register that moment, and then it does become didactic in that way at that moment. And I'm actually fine with that. The other thing I would say is that I was thinking about the word association and not metaphor, and we all understand how, let's say, the idea of metaphor can get in the way, in sometimes in a good way, and most of the time in a way where it pushes out other more nuanced, subtle readings. And I think the idea of the association, which is the exact word that Franz Klein used for his paintings, allows you to start to read into it the idea of the spine, the mirror, even the schizo aspect of one side to the other. But I think it does do one thing which you've claimed you've wanted to do, which is, let me modify that. You've claimed you wanted to make a new sound. I think it's made a modified sound. So you're sort of on the way in the music sense of bands, of Bowie, of making the notion of what hair stands for, which is seeing architecture like music as an ecosystem of people working on a project, and then you modify part of it, and that's how you become Jason Payne, let's say, and you work through that. And it's a much more, it's to go back to your thesis, which was the not-so-ideal villa, it's a not-so-ideal version of a gabled house. And so it seems very incomplete in a certain way as a discussion within architecture, but it agitates the discussion of architecture, of contemporary architecture. And that's all you need to do right now, is to agitate it so you clear away, right? So I think it's really important, and that's why I wanted to talk about it, but it's also very beautiful. So congratulations.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Jason. He's obviously a unique voice and a unique presence in LA, and we look forward to further mischief. Hasta la vista.